Good afternoon, everybody. Eden's going to keep letting folks in, and then we're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. I can't see everybody because I've got my presentation up. Scrolling through, looking at everybody. It's so good to see everybody here. Thank you for joining us today.
I'm not hearing you.
So why don't we go ahead and get started? It's 1 after 2 o'clock Eastern time. First of all, I'm Caroline Brower. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Wildlife Refuge Association. Thank you to everybody for joining us here today. Joining with us is Courtney Lewis, our Director of Development, and Eden Taylor, who's our Communications Associate. And that's from the Refuge Association. And we also have some folks from the Coalition of Refuge Friends and Advocates. I don't know, Joan, if you want to introduce, and Cheryl, if you want to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, I'm Joan Patterson. I am with Coalition of Refuge Friends and Advocates. We're a group that's really trying to create a network of support for the Friends community. And let me turn it over to Cheryl.
And I'm Cheryl Hart, and I'm also with the Coalition and also with NWRA and from Friends of Tualatin.
Wonderful. All right, thanks everybody. We are going to do sort of our standard format. If you've been on our calls before, typically what we do on these Friends Quarterly calls is I'll give a presentation for 20 to 30 minutes. I think this one might be a little bit shorter than normal. And then, and I'm gonna pause, go ahead and show you the agenda. So I'm gonna be talking about the congressional timeline and then what the president's agenda is going on for the next couple of months, and then the Refuge Association agenda. And then we're going to start talking about Friends. And what I'm going to do is pause after each one of these items and ask if there are any questions in the chat. So if you have any questions for the first 3 items, why don't you go ahead and put them in the chat? I'm going to be talking about appropriations and Build Back Better and all that kind of stuff that's going on in here in DC. And then when we get to the Friends agenda, I'm going to open up the floor and I'm going to turn the PowerPoint off, so we can have a conversation, and you can unmute at that point. I want this to be what we typically do, which is have a conversation amongst friends about what your concerns are, what's going on at your refuge. So that open conversation is what I particularly value about these calls. So I see a lot of people are adding their name and their refuge into the chat. If you haven't done that, please go ahead. And let's go ahead and get started. So again, I'm Caroline Brower with the Refuge Association. On this quarterly call, what I want to do is to go over, the state of play for appropriations in particular is the big one coming up in the spring. And I also want to talk about a couple of other items that Congress and the president are prioritizing right now. And then I also want to talk about specifically what the Refuge Association is working on to support refuges and the refuge system and friends groups. And then we're going to go and unmute and we can have a conversation. So first things first is appropriations. We are in fiscal year 2022 now. That fiscal year started on October the 1st of 2021. It runs through the end of September. There still is no final bill to fund FY 2022. We are under what's called a continuing resolution, which the current one that we're under, which they did right before Christmas, does not expire until February 18th. Coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, the FY 2023 process typically starts around that time, around mid-February, when the president's budget request is typically released. I don't know, because there is no bill to fund the rest of this current fiscal year on the books right now, we may not see the president's budget request before the typical mid-February date. I just don't know when they're going to put it out. It's sort of like you get 2 days notice that they're going to be putting it out. So, funding levels for refuges are really, really uncertain right now. The president's budget request last year requested an $80 million increase to refuge funding for staff and for maintenance and everything that goes into funding your local refuge and the refuge system as a whole. So there was an $80 million requested increase. The House of Representatives also had an increase of almost $80 million. I think it was 80.5. It was not quite as much as the president's budget request. And then the Senate had a large increase as well. It wasn't quite as much. It was about $51 million was the Senate increase. I don't know if we're going to get those. As everybody knows, the Senate is split 50-50 right now. Kamala Harris, the vice president, is a tie-breaking vote, but they can't do a funding bill under a 50 vote margin or 51 vote margin. They have to have 60 votes, and they don't have 60 votes. The Democrats don't. The Democrats in general want to pass a full year bill, an actual bill that has their budget increases that they want and that they have asked for and have fought for. The Republicans, if they can stop a full year bill happening and just get a continuing resolution for the next year, we are going to be continuing under those lower level funding levels. So if we get another CR continuing resolution that would go to the end of September, we're going to be looking at a continuation of that $503 million level of funding, not the closer to 584, which is what the president's budget request asked for. So that, in a nutshell, is really what's happening with appropriations. I'm going to be sending out, hopefully in the next 2 weeks, I want to see if we can get a Friends letter out asking for Friends groups to sign onto a letter to Congress asking them to fund a full year bill. I don't know whether it will, I don't know if we can move the needle and make such a difference, but we really, really, really need to be making our voices heard in Congress to get an increase done for this year and for next year as well. So testimony in the House. So sorry. Did somebody have a question? Okay. So for the years before COVID, I'm talking about this last line item on here, testimony of the House. We had asked Friends groups to come in and testify before Congress in support of increased funding levels for the refuge system. We last year, because there was no testimony allowed in person, we were able to get almost over 24 Friends groups submitted testimony. And thank you to everybody who submitted testimony last year. It made a huge difference. The House and the Senate both had large increases in their budgets or in their bills. So testimony for FY 2023 for the House will probably be due somewhere in March. It could be as early March. It could be late March. The Senate is usually a little bit later, sometime in April. So I will be sending out information, but if you can start thinking about your testimony, and this is my big request for Friends members coming out of this webinar, is to please work on your testimony for 2023. Like I said, we're looking at a March deadline or so. So we have about probably 6 to 8 weeks to work on testimony. It's max 4 pages. So that's the maximum you can do. You can do 1 page. But just what I need for individual friends and Friends groups to testify about is what is the impact of low funding levels on your refuge? I've been talking to a lot of folks recently about staffing levels at their refuge and how low those staffing levels are. And some refuges that had 25 staff 10 years ago are functioning with 6 or 7 staff now, and it's not a sustainable situation. So that's the kind of thing that we need Friends to talk about. Is we only have a refuge manager and 1 maintenance staffer, and we can't have an environmental education program that is shuttered, or the biological work isn't happening, the duck banding isn't happening. Our Friends members can't come on and volunteer because we don't have a volunteer coordinator. That kind of work, that kind of thing is really, really impactful. So if you can start thinking about that kind of stuff, and what you can put in testimony, I would love to beat our 24 Friends groups this year. So any questions about appropriations right now? I'm going to go ahead and stop there, because this is the meat of what we really need in the late winter, early spring from Friends. So Joan, are there any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
And then Mike Baldwin also has a question. So let's go with Mike's first. Is the process for submitting to the House going to be easier than it was last year?
Let me reach out to the House. The House is the one that was truly difficult last year. They wanted resumes and all that kind of stuff. It was ridiculously complicated last year. So I will reach out to them and see if I can clarify whether they need bios and resumes and all that kind of stuff. They have ridiculous requests. So I will reach out and ask Mike. That's an excellent point.
Okay, and then Paula has the exact same question that I have. So glad you asked it, Paula. Paula wants to know, can you share examples of testimony that has been submitted in the past? Where could that be located?
Absolutely. So yes, absolutely. We will get that put together and we will send that out to folks probably in early February. We'll get that out to people. There is some online, and I'm looking at Eden. She doesn't know I'm looking at her, but Eden, do we still have that up on our website from last year with all the testimony?
Yeah, we do have some of the sample testimony that we've had for the previous years. We actually do also have, I think, some previous video of Friends members testifying for Congress too. So we can put a little package together.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Eden.
Uh-huh.
All right, I'm making a note about the email House staff. Okay, any other questions on the appropriation side?
That's it. That's all I can see.
Oh, can I? This is Mike Scott. I've got a quick question.
Sure.
Are there any restrictions against former federal employees, specifically Fish and Wildlife Service employees, from providing testimony?
No.
Thank you.
Were you this is Carol Armstrong, Friends of Heinz Refuge. Was someone suggesting that videos could be submitted by individuals?
No, I think Eden said that. So in past years, we have been able to invite friends, or the House has invited friends in for Public Witness Day. And I think 2 years ago when we did that, Justin with Nisqually and Rachel Carson, Bill, was it Bill? My brain is, okay. So Bill had come in to testify for the Friends of Rachel Carson. So that was the last time, and I think that's probably what Eden's talking about, is those videos of the testimony before Congress. But that was at Public Witness Day in front of the congressional members. But no, there's not you can't, it's all written testimony, I'm assuming. So. Any other questions before I move on? This is great. I like this format. All right. So other congressional business. I'm sure everybody's heard that Senator Manchin is really the linchpin in the Build Back Better agenda, which is all of the climate provisions that the Democrats wanted to get done this year. And it also had the Arctic protections. This is the bill that was going to repeal the 2017 Tax Act that opened up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil and gas development. We have to get that done, and it has to be done this year. If we get into a situation where there's an election coming up and the Republicans, take either the House or the Senate, we're never going to get that passed, and we will have oil and gas development in the Arctic Refuge within a decade, I would guess. So that has to happen this year. It's pretty critical that we get something done from Build Back Better. But for right now, that bill has been shelved. They don't have the votes for it, and so they aren't able to move it right now. So what they've done is they've shelved it. They're moving on to voting rights. Y'all might have seen that the president was down in Georgia a couple of days ago this week, giving, I think it was yesterday, gave a big speech, which I didn't see, so I'm not sure exactly what he said. But he gave a speech on voting rights. And the reason he went down to Georgia is he's trying to push this big bill on voting, to open up voting in a lot of these states. I did want to mention in here COVID. They did a big COVID bill last year, also through reconciliation, which is the process where they only have to have 50 votes in the Senate instead of 60. So they did a big COVID bill earlier this year, in early 2021. I see no intention of doing another COVID bill. So I did want to mention that even with the Omicron surge, they're really, really trying to keep everything open. And I don't see another bill like that coming up. The big thing that's going to be impacting congressional business this year is the elections in November. We're looking at the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election, 435 House seats plus the territories, and we're also looking at 34 of the Senate seats are up for re-election. And I do have that map up so you can see where your senators are. We are looking at a special election in Georgia, Arizona, and in California. So this is Kamala Harris's old seat. This is John McCain's old seat that Mark Kelly currently has. And this is the one that Raphael Warnock won last year in a special election. So now he's up for re-election there. There also are some retiring senators, which are the dark states. The ones that are light, see the light blue and the light red, that means that it's a incumbent senators is running for re-election there. But these seats are open. So Senator Leahy in Vermont, Senator Toomey in Pennsylvania, Portman in Ohio, Blunt in Missouri, Shelby in Alabama, and then Senator Burr in North Carolina. Of note, Senator Shelby is a big appropriations guy. He has been atop the Senate Appropriations Committee, so the top Republican for years and years and years. So he's been in there for a long time. So it's going to be a shift. I'm interested to see how these states go. So you can look on here and see if you have an election coming up in November. But this is going to be a big deal. They have to be able to. They're going to recess. Towards October. So we're really looking at a limited year's worth of legislation this year because of the election. All right. Are there any questions? Whoops. Are there any questions about that, Joan? I assume probably not.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
Okay. I figured the ones were going to come from appropriations. So I wanted to go briefly onto the Biden administration's agenda. A lot of these are similar to what the Senate and the House are doing, just because they're coordinating, and the Democrats are in control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So they're really looking towards Build Back Better, voting rights, climate change, and also looking to do this president's budget request coming out in February. And every time you talk to anybody from the administration, even still a year in, they are still talking about these 4 pillars, which are their big priorities. They're talking climate change, battling COVID, racial equity, and improving the economy. So when you see their talking points coming out in the news on these 4 things, that's why they're pushing so hard about this. I see so much stuff coming out about improving the economy and job numbers and all that. It's because it's one of their 4 top priorities. All right, any questions about the Biden administration's agenda before I move on to the Refuge Association's agenda? Anybody have any questions about it? I don't know if there's any in the chat or not.
Nothing in the chat.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask about either congressional or administration priorities right now? Okay. Moving on. All right, so these priorities are actually really similar to what I had in my presentation from September, which was our last quarterly call. We're still working on a lot of these issues. So some things that I'm really focused on are border wall fencing and restoration of refuge lands in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas along the border. We're still looking at Eisenbeck Refuge. We have to keep that road out of there. We are still looking at long-term protections of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We are doing a lot of work on our urban program. Angie Horn is now running our entire urban program, and she is trying to hire additional staff in regions 4 and 5. So outside of the Arthur R. Marshall Loxahatchee Refuge in Florida is where that person would be based. And up in New England is the other one. It's either Boston or New York are the 2 locations that are possible for that staffer. So we are looking to expand our urban program as well with the Refuge Association. We have a staffer, Julie Morris, down in South Florida, and we are really focused on the Everglades headwaters and wildlife corridors in South Florida. And the big thing that's really started getting really active with this administration is 30 by 30 in climate change, including wildlife refuges, for expansion, seeing how we can take some of these public lands that are in the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service and transferring them into the refuge system so that we can be able to better conserve those lands. And, there are a lot of Bureau of Land Management lands that are, they don't qualify to be included under the 30 by 30 criteria for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So if we could get those lands and transfer them into the refuge system, which is not an easy task, by the way, we could really, start to move the needle on refuge expansion and building out the refuge system. The other side of that refuge expansion is looking to see how we can that we can acquire lands that are within the already approved acquisition boundary for already existing national wildlife refuges. So there are a lot of refuges that still have room within their acquisition boundary for acquisitions. So we want to see how we can, help build those out. Right now, we're looking at some land acquisition at Valle de Oro and talking to a lot of folks about that. I think it's 100 acres or so at Valle de Oro. There's a land acquisition project at Okefenokee in South Georgia. And there's one at Hines as well in Philadelphia. So there's a number of places that we're, looking at expanding or increasing lands within the acquisition boundary. The other side is new refuges. There's one in particular that we're very involved in, and that's the Western Riverside County National Wildlife Refuge in Southern California. So outside of Los Angeles, that's in Ken Calvert's district in California, and he's been very engaged in that and supportive. So we are still working on figuring out how to do that. It's a huge refuge. It would be 500,000 acres potentially. So it's a huge area and would be, I think, one of the largest urban refuges in the country, first or second potentially. So are there any questions about this? We are also working, I would add that we're also working on, individual refuge issues as well. There are always individual issues that come up. There's this transmission line across the Upper Miss Refuge, this maglev train that they're trying to run across the Patuxent Refuge in Maryland, between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. So there are other refuges that we're engaged in as well, outside of, the ones like Eisenbeck and Arctic, which we talk about all the time. And I know other friends outside of Alaska are sick and tired of hearing us talk about, but there are other refuges that we're also very vocal and interested and engaged in. So any questions on this in the chat, Joan?
Yep, there are a number of questions. The first question is, do you think that the Biden administration's agenda on climate change recognizes the value of the National Wildlife Refuge system?
I do, actually. So one thing that we've been doing, I've been having monthly calls with the refuge system, with Eric Alvarez, who's their chief of realty and budget. He's pulling double duty right now. So we meet with him monthly. We've also met with Shannon Estenos, who's the assistant secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We've met with her about this as well. So they are interested in it and very recognizing the fact that refuge lands are a critical component to wildlife corridors and maintaining wildlife populations in an age of climate change. Are they going to provide additional funding to, acquire lands? They're talking a good game. Let's see if we can get the money for it, though.
Okay, next question. And Karen, if I'm not stating your question correct, please chime in. Pardon my ignorance, but why would the National Wildlife Refuge System not be included in 30 by 30?
It is.
It is, okay.
It is. So what the administration is framing it as is they're calling it America the Beautiful. And so they just came out with a progress report on America the Beautiful a week or two ago, I believe. And I'm trying to remember, refuges were mentioned, I don't know, 8 to 10 times in that report, I believe. So it was definitely included in the report. Is it the big sweeping stuff that I would, hope that they would do? One of the things that we're looking at is, for example, a corridor between, Hart Mountain and Sheldon National Wildlife Refuges in Southern Oregon, Northern Nevada. So would we love to be able to acquire or transfer the BLM lands between there into the refuge system to create one huge refuge? Yes. Is there, we've had conversations with BLM about transferring those lands. They don't want to let go of their lands. So it's going to be a challenging thing to be able to get that. But yes, they are talking about it.
And from Carrie, assuming land expansion, of course, head count would need to be expanded to manage that additional land.
Yes.
Is that part of 30 by 30?
It is. That's a very good question. It is, as far as I'm aware, it's not something that's been written down that they are going to be focused on increasing operations and maintenance funding. But that is something that I am a broken record on. I go to meetings and that's all I talk about is if you're going to add lands to the refuge system, you have to increase capacity and staff. You cannot take a refuge system that is already so understaffed and give them an additional 4 million acres. There's not enough staff to cover that. So they are aware of it, and we talk about it a lot. So yes.
And when was the last new National Wildlife Refuge added to the system, and what was it?
Somebody may know this better than I do. I want to guess. I think it was Green River in Kentucky. Was that the last one? I think Bog Mountain and then Great Thicket. So Bog Mountain Bogs. I can't remember what it was in North Carolina. Was also one of the most recent ones. That was maybe 567, and I think 566 was Great Thicket in New England. But I could be wrong about that. But I think those were the most recent ones. I'm pretty sure Green River was the last one.
I think you're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Google says Green River.
Okay.
Thank you. And then from John Andrews, also opposition to the proposed strip mine adjacent to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. Can you give us a summary of what's going on there?
John Andrews asking me for an update?
Well,
maybe John Andrew give me an update. John, why don't you give us an update on Okefenokee? You're the one who's working on it.
Well, I just saw that you were listing other things that the Refuge Association is monitoring or battling, however you want to put it. And this is a mine that's proposed, a titanium oxide mine that's immediately adjacent to Okefenokee Refuge that would withdraw a huge amount, millions of gallons of water a day from the groundwater and threaten the health and vitality of the swamp and the refuge. So the Refuge Association has been actively involved in that, participating in Okefenokee Protection Alliance, a group of about 30 organizations that are opposing the mine. So I just wanted to mention that. Thanks, Carolyn.
Yeah, no, thank you, John. Yeah, it was, I had it listed at the bottom of the screen, and I didn't want to get into listing individual refuges because I always leave refuges out when I start listing individual ones. But yes, Okefenokee is a big one. And we do have John on the ground in Florida, and he's been working really hard on that one. So, and really coordinating with all of those coalition partners. So he's the guy to give the update. So thank you.
From Jim Chapman.
Yes.
Down in Texas, all federal interest, is there any federal interest in increased tree planting on national wildlife refuges?
I think there's always interest in it, but it's not I have not seen it pushed as a priority, no.
Okay. What is the priority acquiring, I'm assuming, lands to refuges or fully funding management of areas already in the system? Many refuges have significantly insufficient management dollars.
That was Mike Scott.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
You
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah. So staffing shortages are something that we are going to be making a big priority. So we actually had a staff meeting about this on Monday, about the importance of the Refuge Association really elevating this problem with staffing shortages and lack of capacity. It's all well and good for a refuge to, lose a couple staff and you can't do this little number of things. But we're getting to the point where refuges are like over half of refuges have no staff on site, and the refuges that do have staff on site, sometimes it's one staffer, and which is not safe. I'm hearing from folks up in Region 5, for example, about how when the beaches, the beaches that are refuges, there's no staff there. And so people are bringing their dogs, and this is really, really critical shorebird nesting habitat. And this is where shorebirds come to refuel and eat, and people are letting their dogs run through these big clouds of shorebirds, and the birds fly up, and people think it's so cool. But when they're doing that multiple times a day, these birds are losing all of that energy, and they can't last. And it's not a sustainable situation. But they don't have any staff to be able to go down on the beach and tell people to not let their dog do that. And that's just one example from across the country. That kind of stuff. That is what I need from Friends in testimony this year. That kind of story about what it means on your refuge. This is our big push this spring, is to really tell the story about what a lack of staffing and a lack of operational capacity is doing to refuges. Refuges are critical for wildlife populations in this country. And if we don't have the staff there, these areas are small. They can't function without management. If you're looking at refuges like the Desert National Wildlife Refuge or CMR or Charles and Russell in Montana, or the Alaska refuges, most of them, these areas are large enough that they're somewhat self-sustainable. You don't need to come in and do active management. But in the vast majority of the lower 48, that's just not the case. We have to have staff to make these areas good habitat for wildlife. That's the kind of stuff that we need stories about. This is our big push. That right there is our big push for this spring.
Okay.
Need your help.
So, Caroline, what's the path forward for removal of border wall fencing?
We need the money. So here's the problem. We've had multiple conversations with the Border Patrol. We've had multiple conversations with the Department of Homeland Security. We've had multiple conversations with the Department of the Interior. I have a meeting in 2 weeks with Deb Holland's top folks who are working on this within this coalition of groups that I'm working with. It's like Defenders and totally blanked on the name, Wildlands Network, Sierra Club. There's a bunch of folks that are working on this. So we're all going to meet with DOI, fairly high officials, on February 28th about this. The path forward is that we have to have funding. The refuge system has told me that they need $100 million in order to take fencing down and do restoration of these lands. That's the needed money. The House in their bill this past year, which is not going to become law, because we can't get a bill passed because it's being filibustered. The House had money in there. It was $100 million for the entire border for wall removal and restoration work. And we're looking at $100 million just for refuges. And there are only 4 impacted refuges along the border. It's Lower Rio Grande is the only one in South Texas that has border wall fencing on it. And then the 3 in Southern Arizona. And so we need that money. We have been looking at Department of Homeland Security appropriations bills. We looked at infrastructure, which already passed and is done. It was not in there. It was not included. And we also had looked at reconciliation to see if we could get into that bill. And so that's our push. We're looking at appropriations and also these standalone bills that are going. But it's border wall fencing removal and restoration has not been the priority that we would like it to be with this administration. But we need the money. That's the path forward.
Okay. Stacy mentions that November 2019, Green River National Wildlife Refuge in Kentucky was the last one created. From Friday over in Friends of Huckala, restoration of pastures, tree planting for forest birds habitat has been one of their priorities for the last 35 years. And then we have a question about Merritt Island. We have a unique situation at Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. The Kennedy Space Center is in the middle of the refuge. There is a proposed new launch pad for SpaceX that would impact over 100 acres of wetland. We may need some help from the association to address this. So heads up.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Elon Musk is, his name has come up a number of times within meetings that I've been in recently. Yes, we're having those conversations. I would shoot me an email. We can talk about that.
Okay. And from Barbara, border wall construction and road construction continues in South Texas under the umbrella of the levee construction and restoration. Any chance of getting this stopped? There's no restoration if you're putting down roads along the border wall. Also, can you say a word or two about what's gone out for public comment in Arizona and California about habitat restoration along the wall?
Thanks, Barbara. So in terms of fencing that keeps happening under the guise of the levee walls, we are aware that that's happening. There are a lot of people raising Cain about this, and it's not stopping. We've written letters, we have, been on calls, we have talked to people privately, had meetings. Like I said a minute ago, the removal of this border fencing is frankly not even on the table with this administration. They have, from what I've seen, they don't have any interest in removing border fencing. So it's a big problem. There's a lot of lack of political will to do that.
Okay.
That's not the answer I know you want. It's a problem.
So from Kim McNeil, Peach Creek was added to St. Bernard National Wildlife Refuge, 4,000 acres. Hey, that's great.
Awesome.
And from Karen, a follow-up to her previous questions. Do you have info on the FASTA Act of 2016? Karen might need to email you directly about this, but the question is because apparently Patuxent Research Refuge is interested in receiving 105 acres of forest tract adjacent to the refuge from NASA, which owns the tract and no longer wants it. But because of FASTA and something to do with OMB, that tract may get put up on the open market
and turned into a housing development.
Interagency transfer.
Yes, I saw. Did you write that op-ed? I don't, who was asking that question?
This is Karen. So Karen, if you could unmute yourself, that would be great.
Karen, was that your op-ed in the Washington Post?
Hi, no, that was not.
Okay. So there was an op-ed in the Washington Post. I think it was published on Friday. So I first became aware of this on Monday, the NASA 105 acres. So I brought that up to Eric Alvarez, who's the chief of realty. I had a call with him on Monday afternoon, and I did mention that to him, and I asked him what was happening. Is Fish and Wildlife Service interested in getting that property? He said they absolutely want it. It's within the acquisition boundary. They want to do a land transfer. They are doing what they can to transfer that. So they are internally working on that. So I don't know if they can get around that bill. They are trying to, though.
My understanding is that what I understood was, and again, pardon my lack of information in some ways, but my understanding was that somehow or another a clock has been triggered, and that Congress has to act by January 26th or 27th, or it goes up for on the open market. The refuge had expressed interest in receiving the tract of land back in the fall. And I'm not sure, I don't have an understanding of this particular act and, why this clock got triggered rather than it being allowed to happen under interagency.
My understanding that NASA doesn't want to give it, but that's just anecdotal. I don't know if that's actually true or not. I know that there's a deadline. I don't know enough about the act, to be honest with you, to be able to tell you, the minutia of what it means and, whether a clock has been triggered or not. So I will look into it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I understand. Someone had said it had to do with the act had been signed by President Obama, and then changes were made to it under the following administration. And I don't know, somehow or another, this land was recommended for disposal. And that's how it ended up in this situation.
Yeah. What I do know is that Fish and Wildlife Service, and like I said, I only learned about this on Monday. So I know that Fish and Wildlife Service is doing what they can to get it.
Yeah, and I understand there are some, I think a senator and a representative who are supportive in Maryland.
Okay.
So we're hopeful, but I was just trying to get a better understanding of this. To me, this kind of thing, I would like a better understanding of the FASTA Act and how this has happened, because the refuges are the sort of green blobs, like that article said. People look at the map and they're like, hey, here's this unused land. And of course, we all think of it as used in a different way and very valuable for different reasons. But people looking for land to develop see it very differently. So,
yep.
So these kinds of potential incursions to refuges are just going to continue. And I wanted a better understanding of how we can prevent this FASTA Act thing from being triggered.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to take a look at it. I think it's the problem is that age-old question of what's the highest and best use. I think that real estate developers have a different definition than what everybody on this call has. So
yeah, thank you.
Of course.
This is Mike Scott again. Is there any chance that a third party friendly to the refuge, Patuxent, could purchase the property and hold it?
Well, I think part of the problem is if it goes on the open market, if it's available, if it could be used for housing development, it might be extremely expensive. So I think the idea is, plan A is to do an interagency transfer. Plan B might be to talk to a land trust, but I haven't had those conversations with anybody.
Yeah, we have some people who are looking into species that are currently on that tract of land. I know that it's a mature forest, decades old, and critical for so many reasons. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And then Caroline from Vicky, Friends of the Wildlife Quarter in South Texas. What can this group do to fight the border wall? Funding occurred in the last administration, and no one seems interested in trying to undo that funding. The wall is going up on refuges.
The Refuge Association can do, I'm pausing because I'm trying to think if we've done an action alert on this recently. Eden would probably know better than I do. I don't think we've done one in the last couple of years on this. We had these expectations at the beginning of the Biden administration that, they were going to stop building additional border fencing, but they haven't. They're building it, like somebody else said, under the guise of, rebuilding levee walls. But, you go down to South Texas on the Lower Rio Grande, and it's this wild system where there's a fence for a mile and there's nothing for a mile, and then another fence for 2 miles and then nothing for 2 miles. It's the dumbest, most ridiculous situation ever. And it's very, very frustrating. We can look at doing a fence sign-on letter for this. I think other than that, it's contacting your members of Congress, and we can do an action alert and a friend sign-on letter. And see if we can, get some support on this. But, if you want to do something on your own, where are you, Vicky? Are you down in like McAllen or?
I am in McAllen.
Okay.
We oversee Santa Ana and Lower Rio Grande Valley,
Okay.
the wildlife refuge there, where Boca Chica is and SpaceX is.
Okay. Which is another issue down there as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there are some, there are some members along the border that are really supportive of the border fence, and there's others who are not. I know Congressman Vila has been, fighting against this, but others down there are not, and they're supportive. So
he's not so much fighting it anymore because he's lame duck, but he had been an opponent of it historically. Now he's not doing much on it at all.
Yeah.
It just politically, I think politicians are afraid of coming out against it because it makes them look like pro, illegal immigration.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally get it.
Okay, and then a question from Ken at Hakala Forest. There may be a couple of neighboring property owners who wish to offer and or contribute their land, wouldn't that be nice, to the refuge. What is the present policy about accepting contributions and, if necessary, pay related expenses or even a partial contribution to value? Yeah, that's asking that.
That is a question for somebody who's done real estate with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Is there anybody on the call who knows the answer to that? I don't know.
Joe, Ken, one of the things I think we could do is perhaps put you in contact with Joe McCulley, who used to do real estate for Fish and Wildlife Service. And then the other thing too is take a look at Fish and Wildlife Service's donation policy, which does address land acquisition.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I do know that they can accept donations. As far as, whether they would pay for an easement or something like that, absolutely. It just depends on the land and whether it's within the acquisition boundary and that kind of stuff. So, but I don't know a lot of details on what that would.
What we were concerned about is that there was no money in the kitty to even assist with, say, closing costs or surveys, and that you'd have to get that from the donor. Now, there are some donors who are willing to contribute to property if they get, say, X percent of the value back so that they can take the charitable contribution for the balance of it. And that whether there's any money that might be available for that, there wasn't in the past. And with Build Back Better or things of that nature, maybe in the future, the policy might change in this regard.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna stop the questions right now. I know you have one more. I want to open it up for. So I want to close out my screen, and so everybody can.
Well, let me just, as you're doing that, let me just state this one more because it's it's on a good note. So from Susie at Florida Keys, not new, but positive news from Florida Keys Wildlife Refuge Society. Ballast Key was added on the Key West Refuge. It was the last privately owned land within the boundaries, and the 14-acre island was donated by a Key West developer in 2019 to the Nature Conservancy, who deeded ownership to Fish and Wildlife Service. So some good news there.
That's great.
Okay.
All right. So my last slide before we get into friends issues. And we don't have nearly as much time as I was hoping. The Refuge Association is working really hard on behalf of refuges. Here's our link to our donate page, and Eden can put that in the chat as well. If you are interested and able to give a donation to the Refuge Association, we also, if you would like to give money to Corfa as well, you can do that at the same link and put in the notes section that it should be for Corfa or the Coalition of Refuge Friends and Advocates. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see all of your wonderful faces. But I do want to open this up. We have 10 minutes left, 11 minutes left. So, let's have a conversation. I would love to hear from y'all about, what issues that y'all want to have a conversation with each other about, not just with me. The floor is open. Let me look at the chat. Lack of money for staffing. Yes. I mean, in my opinion, that's the biggest issue going on with refuges right now. Just systemically within the refuge system, lack of money is by far the biggest issue. I mean, are y'all seeing that on your refuges? Do you have examples that you could give in, a couple of pages or a paragraph of testimony to the House and the Senate?
And part of what bothers me is when this positions are eliminated.
Yep. Yep, when they totally take them off the books.
Yep.
I mean, from my limited experience in the more rural refuges, there's this major problem of lack of staff having to play multiple roles and how that might contribute to their cynical viewpoints sometimes or burnout. But in a refuge in a heavily populated areas, our urban one, they had, I believe it was 365,000 visitors in 2017 when they did an analysis. So there's a big demand there, to be managing so many people and maintaining the biodiversity of the refuge at the same time. So just, we have a lot of staff, but we have a lot of pressure, visitor pressure. So visitor pressure is another thing to think about.
Yep. Yeah, and Jim points out the lack of law enforcement as well as a huge problem. I know, and I've heard of refuges where there's a law enforcement officer on the site like for 4 hours a week.
Caroline, that's becoming even more of a problem because of the expansion of hunting. And hunting without law enforcement doesn't make a good combination, in our opinion.
Kathy, yes, that is a yes. So Kathy says there were staff positions that are funded but not being processed because of changes in hiring protocols. That is also a big problem. They are trying to run this all out of the central hiring agency, and it's taking forever. I mean, there are positions that are taking a year and a half to get filled. Also a big problem.
Isn't that also a problem with real estate, that it's all going through a central site instead of even being done by Fish and Wildlife Service in terms of appraisals and all?
Yeah, and that was one topic that I talked to Eric Alvarez on Monday about, the realty chief for the refuge system. Is he said that it used to take, I think the max for an appraisal process was like 120 days. He said they're looking at 200 plus days now to get it done. So it's a huge problem. Yes. Yeah, the visitation is a big issue as well, especially with COVID and people wanting to be outside and coming to refuges to visit. So just so everybody, just really think if you can come up with concrete examples on your refuge. It's incredibly helpful to have details. If you've been involved with the Friends for 10 years, and when you first started, they have a refuge manager and 3 biologists and a law enforcement officer and, whoever else. And now they have a refuge manager who's doing all of those jobs. It's having details like that is really, really helpful for staff. And you have to think, when you submit testimony to the House, it's almost always being read by staff. And the staff that work on the appropriations committees are the biggest nerds and detail people you've ever met in your life. If you want to tell them that you have 14 staff and these, they eat that stuff up. They love it. They don't, you don't have to sugarcoat it. They want to know what the dirty details are. That's incredibly helpful.
Make a comment here. Another great thing to do is not just write the testimony, but show the testimony. Invite those staff members, your district folks, out onto your refuge so they can see the impact of limited staff is having on managing those areas and greeting and taking care of visitors.
Yep, absolutely.
Karen's asking.
Yeah.
Too, about should people put in their testimony, should be also asking for changes in the hiring protocol as part of their overall ask.
I'm not sure how much Congress can mandate that. That's more of that's something that the Refuge Association has been talking to, like Martha Williams, the not the acting, the nominated director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So, we've talked to her about that, and we've talked to Shannon Estenos, who's the Fish and Wildlife and Parks acting or assistant secretary. We have talked to all these people about the hiring protocols, and about the need to change them. And I don't know, Martha's been acting for a year, and I don't know how much she's wanting to change right now. But that is definitely something that you can add in there and say. I'm just not sure, specifically, Karen, how much that would be able to help. I don't know what they can do. They might be able to put it in the report that Fish and Wildlife Service needs to look at their hiring protocols, but I think that that's probably the extent that they could go to. But it doesn't hurt to say that.
The reason that I asked that is because it sounds like that's part of the problem, that there's been a change such that everything's slowed down, which maybe this is not analogous, but it reminds me of what's happened to the U.S. Postal Service. If that's part of the problem, then if we don't understand what has changed and why that has slowed down the process, how can we begin to address it? Or how can they begin to address it to fix the problem?
Yeah, it's worth mentioning to them. Absolutely. We included it last year, so I think it was November of last year of 2020 that we published our transition report for the new Biden administration, and we included that in there. It was like one of our top 7 priorities or something, was to really address the hiring protocols. So it's been a problem for longer than that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
In the chat, you guys are providing some great examples of the impact of the staffing shortages. These are just wonderful. Thank you.
Can I jump in with a quick question? Yep. Can you just clarify, do partners submit testimony as well, not just friends groups? So really have no sense of what goes on in those hearings. And then in terms of talking about real estate and the lack of people in the real estate department, that's outside of the scope of our specific refuge. But is that something you could put in a letter too, that we could put in our letters?
Yes.
And I'm just around the boundaries of what goes in a testimony letter and how that process works.
As long as you stick to your 4 pages, you can put whatever you want in there. One thing that you could do is divide your testimony up into 2 sections. I do that usually, but talk about the refuge system and then talk about, border fencing and talk about your individual refuge. You can talk about whatever you want in there. I would definitely tie it to an appropriations level, ask for the money that you want to ask for, and what you think is appropriate. So yeah, I think you can ask for any of that in there. It's all fair game. Even if it's not specific about your refuge, you can do national refuge system issues as well. Lisa, it's not just teleworking due to COVID. They went to this the joint accounting JAO. Somebody help me out. My brain shut down. Joint accounting. I can't remember what the JAO stands for. Sorry. They started this like 5 years ago or something, and it's been a huge problem where it's delayed getting hiring staff. I'm sure that COVID joint accounting office. Thank you. I'm sure that the teleworking and short staff. I know that refuges are short staffed, not just because of a lack of capacity to hire and a lack of funding, but I know that they're also short staffed because the whole country is short staffed right now. So I know that that's contributing to the problem, but it's not the entire story.
And Caroline, one other thing from both Jim and Becca, they've noted that their boards have decreased in size. I'm sure some of this has got to do with COVID. And, how can you re-energize both your board and your membership? So one of the things that Corpa has been talking about, Cheryl and I have been discussing since we try to facilitate the webinars related to Friends governance and management, that we have been talking about having a discussion about how to re-energize your organization. So if you're interested in helping out with that, have ideas of what should be covered, please just shoot me a note and I will put my email address in the chat box now. Okay. And then before we close out, I just want to mention we have another webinar scheduled for next Wednesday at 2:00. This is being done by Lisa Mayo, who is with the Friends of Blackwater, and she specializes in her job on how to make your websites more accessible. All of us as we age have more disabilities. Can we see the screen? Can we hear what's going on? And she really addresses how you can make sure that your website is accessible. And this is important with regards to linking, the service being able to link to your websites too. So that is next Wednesday at 2:00.
2 Eastern. All right, we're going to close out. It's 3:01. Thank you, everybody. We will meet again in 3 months and look forward to hearing everybody's testimony. We will be in touch with border wall letters and action alerts, and we will be in touch with the information on how to get your testimony submitted. So thank you to everybody for getting that prepared. We really appreciate it. All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for your insight.
Thanks.